Greenwich Village is a city in New York located on the west side of Manhattan next to the Hudson River. The village is known for Washington Square Park and its big part in the folk music revival. In the early 1960s, the village was filled with musicians, artists, and actors, young people that wanted to live differently than the rest of money-centered New York. People were encouraged to express themselves through music, art, and their political views. This supportive nature is what helped the music coming out of Greenwich Village to become music that would define a generation, music that was going to make a change. The music that was coming out of Greenwich Village was urban folk music. The music was a socially conscious movement in the 1960s that somewhat combined country music and mainstream pop. Urban folk music is usually acoustic in instrumentation with guitars, banjos, and harmonicas. The lyrics of the songs focused on political issues and protest, and focused on real-life trials of American life. The words were real, sometimes brutally honest, and beautiful. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy gave hope for America in a new era. However, in 1963, JFK was assassinated and the country was distraught. President Johnson then took over office. In 1964, President Johnson was given the green light to do whatever was possible to stop communism in Vietnam. Also in 1960, people fought in protest for equality and equal rights for African Americans and minorities. Both the Vietnam War and the civil rights movements caused protests to erupt around the nation. The protests even affected the music that was coming out of Greenwich Village.
This land is your land, and this land is my land.
Born Woodrow Wilson Guthrie in 1912, Woody started out as a simple hillbilly singer and transformed into a sophisticated musician of protest songs. Woody left home at 16 and had lived through the hardships of the Great Depression as he traveled by train and hitchhiking across America playing music. He saw that the only way to survive was by banding together.
In the skyway, saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me.
In 1940, Irving Berlin released his ballad of God Bless America, which Guthrie despised. In reaction to the piece, Guthrie wrote God Bless America for Me, now known today as This Land Is Your Land. The song shows America's hardships as well as its beauties. Woody Guthrie was one of the first musicians to write a song in protest. Woody started a generation of songs that would fight for the rights of humans and take a political stand. In 1967, Woody Guthrie died of Huntington's disease. Although Guthrie's disease had affected him during the folk music revival, he was one of the most influential artists that helped shape the urban folk music movement and the music in the village.
This land was made for you and me.
If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning. I'd hammer in.
Pete Seeger was born in 1919 into a musical family. Seeger attended Harvard University but left to learn banjo, collect folk songs, and follow his dreams. In 1940, Pete Seeger traveled with Woody Guthrie before World War II and played hits like Shenandoah and Barbara Allen around the country. Later in 1940, Seeger brought Millard Lampell and Lee Hayes together and formed the Almanac Singers, and Guthrie later followed. The group sung only anti-fascist songs. However, when Seeger's old anti-war songs surfaced, the group's career ended. In 1949, Seeger, Hayes, Ronnie Gilbert, and Fred Hellerman formed the Weavers and hit it big in 1951. Their hits included Kisses Sweeter Than Wine and Goodnight Irene, which they learned from Hughie Ledbetter or Lead Belly. However, when the Red Channels listed Seeger as a communist, the Weavers were no longer allowed on television programs. Because of this, the Weavers' success diminished, and the group parted. Pete Seeger then had a very successful solo career, even though he was protested as a communist. Then, in 1959, Pete Seeger, along with others, founded the Newport Folk Festival. The festival is one of the most known folk festivals known. Greats like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez have performed at the festival, and the festival still goes on to this day. Pete Seeger continued to perform and write protest songs. During the Vietnam War, Seeger released Waist Deep in Big Muddy, with lyrics dissing President Johnson that said, "The fool says to push on." Without Pete Seeger's contributions to protest songs and the Weavers' hypnotic harmonies and stylings, we might not have greats like the trio Peter, Paul, and Mary or Bob Dylan. Peter, Paul, and Mary are a folk singing trio that was formed in 1961. The trio debuted their three-part harmony sound and social protest folk music in the folk music venue in Greenwich Village called The Bitter End. In 1962, they recorded their hit album that stayed on top 10 for 10 months, 7 of which the album was number 1. The album included such hits as Lemon Tree and Pete Seeger's If I Had a Hammer.
Lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Little Jackie Paper loved that rascal Puff and brought him strings and sealing wax and other fancy stuff.
When the trio released their Seeger cover, they found themselves in the forefront of a protest movement. The movement would address everything from world hunger and homelessness to civil rights and war. And in 1963, Peter, Paul, and Mary performed during the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King also gave his I Have a Dream speech. The trio, however, was probably most known for their rendition of Blowing in the Wind by the great Bob Dylan. Peter, Paul, and Mary not only helped their careers with their covers, but also helped launch the careers of other folk revival musicians like Gordon Lightfoot and John Denver. The trio also performed Puff the Magic Dragon, which is still known by many people today.
Would lower their flags when Puff roared out his name, singing, Puff the Magic Dragon lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Who fought Puff the Magic Dragon?
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday.
The great Joan Baez was born in 1941 to a Scottish father and a Mexican mother. Baez experienced the racial inequality firsthand growing up because of her dark skin, which caused her to be an outcast. So, Baez focused all her energy by learning to sing and play the ukulele and guitar. At the age of 18, the singer performed at the 1959 Newport Folk Festival. Like most artists in Greenwich Village, she was known for her topical songs promoting social justice, civil rights, and pacifism. Her unique soprano voice had her audience in awe. In 1960, Joan Baez released her self-titled album, which included the hit Donna Donna. Soon after, the singer became the voice of social change. Joan Baez sang Pete Seeger's We Shall Overcome in the March on Washington. Baez also participated and performed at many anti-war movements to end Vietnam. Joan Baez also performed regularly with Bob Dylan and covered many of his works. After the revival, Joan continued to play folk music, and in 1975, she released the gorgeous ballad named Diamonds and Rust. To this day, Joan Baez continues to perform and be the voice of change. She speaks up about political and social issues around the world.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
This is called Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man. Please play a song for me.
Bob Dylan was born Robert Zimmerman on May 24, 1941 in Minnesota. By the age of 10, he had learned to play the harmonica, piano, and guitar. Woody Guthrie was Bob's biggest influence for his style. Even as a young boy, Dylan showed a passion for folk music. By 1961, Dylan had followed Woody Guthrie to Greenwich Village to follow his dreams. And on April 11th, Dylan played his debut performance in the famous club, Greed's Folk City. Shortly after, Dylan was signed to Columbia Records.
Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy, and there is no place I'm going to. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following you.
His self-titled album was released in 1962. However, it only had 2 songs that he wrote. Then, in 1963, Dylan released a self-composed album called The Freewheelin'. The album included many anti-war and protest hits, including Blowing in the Wind, Masters of War, and Hard Rain's Gonna Fall.
I have no one to meet, and the ancient empty streets too dead for dreaming.
In 1964, Dylan released 2 albums, The Times They Are A-Changin', which was his most overly message-oriented album, and The Other Side of Bob Dylan, which more showed who Bob Dylan was. On the album The Times They Are A-Changin', the song Only a Pawn in Their Game bluntly put the issues of civil rights with lyrics like, "A South politician preaches to the poor man, you have more than the blacks, so don't complain."
Take me on a trip upon your magic swirling ship. My senses have been stripped. My hands can't feel the grip. My toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering.
Bob Dylan is more known for his beautiful and honest lyrics, not necessarily for his musical talent. However, some choose to disagree and find his voice incredible. Bob Dylan's songs were covered by many artists of the time, including Joan Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary. But his songs continue to be covered by major hit artists like Mumford & Sons and Ed Sheeran. In my opinion, Bob Dylan has been one of the most influential artists to date and is looked at by many as a legend. In Greenwich Village, every musician supported each other. They played each other's songs and were inspired by some of the greats. The urban folk revival was filled with music that shaped a generation and helped make change happen.